8 miles, that was the distance between life and death. And Rowan Ashvale was dragging 300 pounds of dying AlphaKing through a blizzard at negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with exactly 90 minutes before they both froze to death. Her lungs burned with each gasping breath. Ice crystals formed on her eyelashes, blurring her vision until the world became nothing but endless white and the dark shape of the massive wolf she was hauling through snow that came up to her waist. Her arms screamed in protest, muscles torn and trembling from 2 hours of relentless pulling. The makeshift harness she'd fashioned from her jacket and belt dug into her shoulders hard enough to draw blood, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to the abandoned hunting cabin she'd spotted from the ridge. The wolf, no, not just a wolf, something far more powerful left a trail of crimson behind them. 7 deep gashes carved across his massive black body, silver poison leaching into his bloodstream with every labored heartbeat. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that told Rowan he was running out of time. She was running out of time too. Her fingers had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Her toes had stopped hurting, which was worse than the pain. That meant frostbite was setting in. Her core temperature was dropping. Soon her body would start shutting down non-essential functions. Then the confusion would come, the drowsiness, the overwhelming urge to just lie down in the snow and sleep. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other. Drag, step, drag, step. The rhythm became a prayer, a meditation, the only thing keeping her conscious and fighting. Behind them, somewhere in the whiteout conditions of the blizzard, 14 rogue wolves were hunting. She'd lost them an hour ago when the weather worsened, but rogues were tenacious. They'd keep searching. And when they found her, they would finish what they'd started. Rowan's mind drifted back to 2 hours earlier, to the moment that had changed everything. She'd been following the river south, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and Silvercrest Pack territory. 4 days of walking, 4 days of cold and hunger, and the soul-crushing weight of rejection pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. The mate bond that Garrett Ironwood had severed still ached, a phantom limb that throbbed with every heartbeat, reminding her that she'd been deemed worthless by the one person who was supposed to cherish her above all others. The attack had happened without warning. One moment the forest was silent, except for the howl of wind through pine branches. The next, the air exploded with snarls and the metallic scent of fresh blood. Rowan had frozen behind a fallen log, watching in horror as 14 rogues swarmed a single black wolf. But this was no ordinary wolf. Even outnumbered and already bleeding from multiple wounds, the creature fought with a ferocity and skill that took her breath away. He moved like liquid shadow, all controlled power and devastating precision. When his jaws closed around a rogue's throat, bones snapped like kindling. When his claws raked across another attacker's flank, the force sent the smaller wolf tumbling 15 feet through the snow. But the rogues had silver weapons, crude daggers fashioned from melted-down coins and broken jewelry, but effective enough. Every slash that connected sent the black wolf staggering, silver poison burning through his system and sapping his supernatural strength. Rowan should have stayed hidden, should have let nature take its course and continued her journey south, away from pack politics and violent territorial disputes that had nothing to do with her. She was nobody, a rejected Omega with no pack, no family, and no future. Getting involved would only get her killed. But she couldn't watch, couldn't sit there while something beautiful and powerful was destroyed by creatures who attacked like cowards all at once with poisoned blades. Her mother had been an herbalist before rogues had killed her 11 years ago. Rowan had inherited that knowledge, including the location of every medicinal plant in a 50-mile radius. Wolf's bane grew in shadowy patches beneath old-growth pines, highly toxic to werewolves. Lethal in large doses. She'd gathered it 3 days ago, thinking she might need protection from threats on the road. Now she pulled the leather pouch from her pack hands, shaking as she ground the dried purple flowers between her palms. The wind was in her favor, blowing from her position toward the fight. She waited until the largest concentration of rogues clustered together, then threw the powder into the air and prayed. Wolf's bane affected different wolves in different ways depending on exposure and individual sensitivity. For some, it caused temporary paralysis. For others, violent nausea. All of them experienced the same primal terror response, an overwhelming urge to flee from the source of contamination. The rogues scattered, not all of them. 6 remained too focused on their dying prey to notice the subtle scent of wolf's bane in the air. But 8 fled into the forest, and that was enough. The black wolf collapsed, just dropped mid-strike, his legs folding beneath him as silver poisoning finally overwhelmed his system. The remaining rogues closed in for the kill. Rowan didn't remember making the decision to intervene. One moment she was crouched behind the log. The next, she was running, screaming at the top of her lungs, waving her arms like a madwoman. The rogues turned, saw a small female Omega alone and unarmed, their lips pulled back in grins that showed too many teeth. Well, well, the largest one said, shifting to human form. He was scarred and filthy, wearing stolen clothes that didn't fit. Looks like we get a bonus prize today, boys. Alpha King and a pretty little Omega to play with. Alpha King. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. This wasn't just a powerful wolf. This was the wolf, the ruler of the Northern Territories, the apex predator that even other alphas feared and respected. And he was dying at her feet. The rogue leader took a step toward her. Rowan pulled out the only weapon she had, a small silver knife she'd taken from her mother's belongings years ago. The blade was only 3 inches long, meant for harvesting delicate roots, not fighting werewolves. But silver was silver. Stay back, she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. I'm marked by Wolf's Bane. You come near me, you'll regret it. It was a bluff. She'd thrown all her Wolf's Bane powder. But rogues were paranoid by nature, always watching for tricks and traps. The leader's eyes narrowed. He took a step back. That's when the Alpha King moved. Even dying, even poisoned, he recognized the threat to Rowan and reacted. His jaws clamped around the rogue leader's ankle. Bones shattered. The rogue went down screaming. The others rushed forward. Rowan didn't think. She lunged, driving her tiny silver knife into the nearest rogue's shoulder. He howled and stumbled back. Another rogue swiped at her with claws extended. She felt 4 lines of fire open across her ribs as his claws connected, but she'd already moved, rolling beneath his guard and slashing upward with the silver blade. The Alpha King was fighting too slower now, visibly weakening, but still dangerous. Between them, they managed to create enough chaos, enough pain and confusion that the remaining rogues made a tactical retreat. They didn't run far, just backed into the trees, regrouping, waiting for the Alpha King to cheat so they could finish their work without resistance. Rowan knew they had minutes at best. The Black Wolf's breathing had become alarmingly shallow. His eyes were glazed with pain. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the snow crimson. Can you shift? She asked him, not knowing if he could understand in his current state. Those eyes focused on her face. Intelligent, aware. He shook his massive head once. Too weak. The shift required energy he didn't have. In this form, he was too heavy for her to carry. But she had to try. That's when she'd fashioned the harness, looped it around his chest, and started dragging. The rogues had followed for the first mile, hanging back just out of sight, but always there. Then the blizzard had intensified, and visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. They'd lost the trail in the whiteout conditions. But that same blizzard was killing Rowan and the Alpha King just as surely as any rogue attack. Her foot hit something solid. She almost sobbed with relief. The cabin. She'd found it. The structure was small, probably used by human hunters in the fall. One room with a stone fireplace, a single broken window, and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. But it had walls and a roof, and right now that was everything. Getting the Alpha King inside took the last of Rowan's strength. She dragged him across the threshold, positioned him near the fireplace, and collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath that wouldn't come fast enough. Her hands were bleeding. The cuts on her rib burned like fire. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But rest meant death, for both of them. Rowan forced herself to move. There was firewood stacked in the corner, old and dry. She used her lighter down to its last few sparks and got a small fire going. Heat bloomed in the tiny space, making her realize just how close to hypothermia she'd come. Then she turned her attention to the Alpha King. In the firelight, his injuries looked even worse. 7 deep gashes, each one exposing muscle and bone. The edges of the wounds were black with silver poisoning, the flesh already beginning to necrotize. If she didn't act fast, the poison would spread to his vital organs. Rowan had no medical supplies, no bandages, no antiseptic, no tools. She had her clothes, a pocket knife, her mother's silver herb knife, and knowledge that might not be enough. She started by packing the wounds with clean snow, using the cold to slow the bleeding. The Alpha King's eyes tracked her movements, watching her work with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. There was trust in that gaze, recognition that she was trying to help. I need to get the silver out, she told him, not knowing if he could understand but needing to say the words anyway. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry. She used the pocket knife to carefully scrape away the blackened flesh around each wound. The Alpha King's body went rigid with pain, but he didn't move, didn't try to pull away, just endured, those violet eyes never leaving her face. Yarrow, she needed yarrow. The herb grew in meadows and along riverbanks, but it might survive near the cabin if she was lucky. Rowan wrapped her torn jacket tighter and ventured back into the blizzard. She found it growing in a sheltered spot near the cabin's foundation. Just a few stalks, winter dormant, but still viable. She gathered what she could and rushed back inside. Yarrow was a natural coagulant and helped neutralize toxins. She chewed the stalks to release their juices, then packed the resulting paste into each wound. The Alpha King's breathing hitched, but still he stayed motionless, letting her work. Bandages came from her spare shirt, torn into strips. She wrapped each wound carefully, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie off the last knot. The Alpha King's fever spiked that first night. His massive body shook with tremors as his immune system tried to fight off the silver poisoning. Rowan kept the fire burning, melting snow for water, and talking to him in a low, steady voice. "You're going to be okay," she said, not knowing if it was true. "I won't let you die. I know what it feels like to want to give up, to think maybe it would be easier to just let go. But you're going to fight, do you hear me? You're going to live through this." She told him about Garrett's rejection, about standing in front of 200 Silvercrest pack members, while the Alpha she'd believed was her destined mate looked her in the eye and said the words that shattered her world. "I, Garrett Ironwood, reject you, Rowan Ashvale, as my mate." The pack had gasped. Some had looked away in pity. Others had whispered behind their hands. A few had actually laughed. "I understood why he did it," Rowan admitted quietly, checking the Alpha King's bandages in the firelight. "I'm nobody. An Omega from a low-ranking family with no political connections, no special abilities, and nothing to offer an ambitious Alpha except genuine love and loyalty. Garrett needed a mate who could advance his position. Someone like Cassandra Vale, the Beta's daughter, who brought alliances with 3 neighboring packs." The Alpha King's eyes opened at her words. In the flickering firelight, they gleamed an unusual violet color that took her breath away. "So I left," she continued, "packed what little I owned, and walked out before dawn. Better to disappear than watch him build his political empire with someone else." She worked through the night, barely sleeping. Every hour she checked the wounds, changed bandages, and tried to get water past his fangs. Several times his breathing became so shallow she thought she was losing him. But each time she would talk urgently, beg him to hold on, and somehow he would rally. Day 2 brought new challenges. The Alpha King's fever climbed to 106 degrees. His body convulsed, muscles seizing as the silver poisoning reached critical levels. Rowan knew she was losing him. 2 of the wounds had become infected despite her best efforts. The flesh around them was hot and swollen, oozing a yellowish discharge that smelled of rot. She had no choice. Using her pocket knife heated in the fire, Rowan cauterized the infected wounds. The Alpha King's eyes flew open, his body arching off the floor in agony, but he didn't shift, didn't attack. Just endured the burning with a stoicism that brought tears to Rowan's eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing clean snow against the cauterized flesh. "I'm so sorry, but the infection would have killed you." Day 3. The rogues returned. Rowan heard them circling the cabin at dawn, 6 of them the survivors from the original attack. They'd tracked the blood trail through the blizzard, patient and persistent as death itself. She barricaded the door with the cabin's single chair and the table, gripped her mother's silver knife in one hand and a burning branch from the fire in the other. If they came through that door, she would fight until she couldn't anymore. But they didn't attack immediately. They circled, tested the windows, scratched at the walls, trying to intimidate her into making a mistake. The Alpha King lay motionless by the fire, too weak even to lift his head. But his eyes were alert, watching the door with predatory focus. One rogue got brave, stuck his muzzle through the broken window, snapping at Rowan with yellowed fangs. She drove the burning branch into his nose. He yelped and retreated. That's when the Alpha King moved. Despite his injuries, despite the silver poisoning and blood loss and days without food, he surged to his feet. The transformation was terrifying. One moment he was dying. The next he was on his feet, lips pulled back in a snarl that showed fangs as long as Rowan's fingers. He didn't speak, couldn't in wolf form, but the Alpha command that rolled off him in waves was a physical force that pressed down on everything within 100 yards. "Leave." The single word echoed in Rowan's mind, carried on that supernatural power. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. It was a command from the most powerful Alpha in existence, and disobedience was literally impossible. The rogues fled, just turned and ran tails between their legs, whimpering like beaten dogs. The Alpha King stood for 3 seconds after they disappeared. Then his legs buckled and he collapsed. The effort of using his Alpha command had drained the last of his reserves. Rowan caught him before his head hit the floor, cradled his massive wolf head in her lap. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now let me save you again." Day 4 brought the first signs of recovery. The Alpha King's fever broke. The wounds, while still serious, showed no further signs of infection. His breathing steadied. Color began returning to his gums, and his eyes, when they opened, held intelligence and awareness that told Rowan he'd been conscious far more than she'd realized. "You heard everything," she said. "It wasn't a question." He dipped his massive head once. "Yes, everything I said about being worthless, about Garrett not wanting me, about thinking maybe it would be easier to just die out here." Another nod. Rowan felt her face flush with embarrassment. But when she met those violet eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw understanding, respect, and something else she couldn't quite name. Day 5, morning came gray and cold. The blizzard had finally eased, though temperatures remained deadly. Rowan was dozing against the wall when the Alpha King's breathing suddenly changed. She jerked awake to find him watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You're better," she whispered, "strong enough to shift." His body began to shimmer. Rowan scrambled backward, pressing against the wall, as the wolf's form blurred and shifted. She'd seen wolves transform before, but never with this kind of power. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy. Light bloomed in the small cabin, so bright she had to shield her eyes. When it faded, a man lay where the wolf had been. Rowan's breath caught in her throat. Even injured, even covered in her makeshift bandages and clearly weakened from blood loss, he radiated a presence that made her Omega nature want to drop to the floor in submission. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with broad shoulders and a warrior's build. His face was all hard angles and sharp edges, with a scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. His hair was black, shoulder-length and tangled, and those eyes, still that same impossible violet, fixed on her face with an expression she couldn't read. "Who are you?" Rowan whispered. His voice when he spoke was rough from disuse, but carried an authority that made the very air seem to vibrate. "My name is Thorn Ravencrest, and I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The words hit like a physical blow. The Alpha King. She'd spent 5 days saving the life of the most powerful wolf in existence. Had touched him and bandaged him and talked to him about her rejection like he was just any wounded creature. "I didn't know," Rowan stammered, trying to back even farther away despite the wall at her spine. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. I should have been more respectful. I shouldn't have touched you without permission." Rowan. The way he said her name stopped her mid-panic. Not commanding, almost gentle. "You saved my life." Thorn continued, shifting slightly and wincing as the movement pulled at his injuries. "You spent 5 days keeping me alive when I would have died in that snow. You used your last supplies, your knowledge, your strength. You defended me from rogues with nothing but a 3-inch herb knife and wolfsbane powder. There is nothing to apologize for." "But I'm just the bravest wolf I've encountered in 150 years," he interrupted. "And I need you to understand something important. When you were talking to me these past nights, telling me about your rejection and your pain, I heard every word. I was conscious more than you knew." Rowan's face flushed hot with humiliation. Everything she'd said. Every confession about feeling worthless about Garrett, not wanting her, about maybe deserving to die alone in the cold. The Alpha King had heard it all. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You shouldn't have had to listen to." "Don't apologize for having feelings," Thorn said firmly. "Don't apologize for being hurt. Garrett Ironwood is a fool. Any Alpha who would reject an Omega with your compassion, your courage, your ability to put someone else's survival before your own is too stupid to deserve you." Tears prickled at Rowan's eyes. No one had spoken to her like this, like she mattered, like rejection hadn't been her fault. "I don't understand," she managed. "Why are you being kind to me?" Before Thorn could answer, sounds from outside made them both freeze. Not wind, not snow sliding off branches. Voices, multiple voices calling out in organized search patterns. Rowan moved to the broken window and felt her blood run cold. There were wolves everywhere. Dozens of them in both human and animal forms, searching through the snow-covered landscape with obvious urgency and purpose. They were all heading toward the cabin, drawn by smoke from the fire, or perhaps by some scent they were tracking. Fear flooded through her. This many wolves moving together with such purpose could only mean one thing. This was a pack on a mission. And she was a rogue Omega alone and vulnerable with no one to protect her. If they decided she had done something wrong, if they thought she had hurt the wolf she'd been tending, "They're looking for you," Rowan said, turning back to Thorn. "Your pack. You should probably let them know you're okay before they assume the worst." Thorn finished, attempting to stand and immediately swaying. Rowan rushed forward without thinking, ducking under his arm to support his weight, despite the intimidating presence of all those searching wolves outside. You need to rest. Those wounds are serious and you've lost too much blood. If you try to move too much right now, you'll tear them open again. Thorn looked down at her with something that might have been amusement. You're still giving me orders. Someone has to, Rowan muttered. You clearly don't have the sense to, The cabin door burst open. 60 wolves in human form flooded the entrance, all wearing expressions of relief and concern and suspicion. They were dressed in military-style tactical gear, armed with silver weapons, and moved with the coordinated precision of a highly trained unit. A woman stepped forward from the group. She was in her 70s, but still carried herself like a warrior with short steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. When she saw Thorn alive and standing, her face transformed with relief. Your Majesty, she said, dropping to one knee. The gesture was mirrored by every other wolf in the doorway. Thank the goddess. We feared you dead. I would be Commander Stormheld, Thorn replied, his arms still draped across Rowan's shoulders for support, if not for this Omega who found me bleeding out and spent 5 days saving my life. Every eye in the doorway turned to Rowan. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of so much attention. These were the AlphaKing's personal guard, his most trusted wolves, elite warriors who'd been searching through a blizzard for days. And they were all looking at her with expressions ranging from gratitude to suspicion to outright shock. She's a rogue, one of them said, a tall male with beta energy and a suspicious face. Lone in neutral territory with no pack scent. Why would a rogue risk herself to help anyone, especially the AlphaKing? Because she has a kind heart, Thorn said, his voice carrying an edge of command that made several guards straighten. And because she understands what it means to suffer alone, to be abandoned by those who should have protected you. Commander Stormheld's expression shifted, something like understanding flickering in her eyes. She looked at Rowan more carefully, taking in the torn clothes, the bloodstains, the exhaustion written in every line of her body. You saved our king's life, the commander said, her voice gentler now. We are in your debt, young Omega. What is your name? Rowan, she managed. Rowan Ashvale. And I didn't do anything special. Anyone would have... No, Thorn interrupted firmly. Not anyone. Most wolves would have walked away. You stayed, you fought, you kept me alive through 5 nights of pain and fever. That is not nothing, Rowan. That is everything. Commander Stormheld stood gesturing to the medics in her unit. We need to get His Majesty back to the palace. Our healers can properly treat those wounds. Later, Thorn said, and the single word carried enough authority that everyone in the room went still. First, I want a full report. How long was I missing? What did you find at the attack site? 5 days, Your Majesty, the commander replied. You left for a routine border patrol on Friday evening. When you didn't return by midnight, we initiated search protocols. We've had every available wolf searching since then, over 300 personnel covering a 500-square-mile radius. 5 days. The Royal Guard had been searching for 5 days while Rowan dragged their king 8 miles through a blizzard, fought off rogues, and kept him alive with nothing but herb knowledge and determination. The attack site, Thorn prompted. Commander Stormheld's expression darkened. We found evidence of 14 rogues, Your Majesty. They used silver weapons, crude but effective. We tracked them as far as we could, but they scattered when the blizzard hit. However, she paused, exchanging glances with another guard. However, what commander? The weapons, Your Majesty. We recovered several of them. They have serial numbers. We traced them back to their source. She took a breath. They came from Silvercrest Pack's armory. And there's more. We intercepted encrypted communications. The rogues were hired. Someone paid them $75,000 to assassinate you during that patrol. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thorn's face went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that came before violence. Silvercrest, he said quietly. Are you certain? Yes, Your Majesty. The evidence is conclusive, and... Commander Stormheld looked at Rowan with something like pity in her eyes. There was a second target named in those communications, an Omega. Orders were to make it look like she froze to death in the wilderness. Her name was Rowan Ashvale. The world tilted sideways. Rowan heard the words, understood them on an intellectual level, but couldn't quite process their meaning. Someone had tried to have her killed. Not just rejected, not just cast out, actually murdered. Garrett, she whispered. He tried to kill me. Not just you, Thorn said, his voice hard as stone. He tried to kill me, too. The question is why. But Rowan already knew. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Garrett hadn't rejected her because she was worthless. He'd rejected her to get her out of the way. Because a true mate bond would have exposed his treachery. She would have sensed his guilt, his deception through the connection they shared. And when rejection wasn't enough, when there was still a chance she might find a new mate who would recognize what Garrett had done, he'd ordered her death. "I think I'm going to be sick," Rowan said faintly. Thorne's arm tightened around her shoulders, the only thing keeping her upright. "Breathe," he murmured. "Just breathe. You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you again." Commander Stormheld stepped closer, her expression now openly sympathetic. "My lady, if you'll allow it, we have medics who can check you for injuries, and we can provide proper clothing, food, whatever you need." "I'm not a lady," Rowan said automatically. "I'm nobody, just a rogue Omega who saved my life," Thorne finished. "Which makes you somebody very important. And there's something else you need to know, Rowan. Something I realized during these 5 days we spent together." His violet eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. The mate bond formed between us. The cabin went completely silent. Rowan stared at Thorne in shock, unable to process the words. Commander Stormheld's eyes went wide. Several guards gasped. Others began whispering excitedly among themselves. "That's impossible," Rowan finally managed. "I was already rejected. The bond with Garrett was—" "Not a true bond," Thorne interrupted gently. "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, Rowan. If Garrett could reject you, it's because you were never truly meant to be his. You were meant to be mine." "But you're the AlphaKing," Rowan protested, her voice rising with something close to panic. "You can't be mated to a rejected Omega with no pack and no status. It would be a scandal. It would undermine your authority. You need someone powerful and connected, someone who can help you lead, not some broken wolf who—" "You are not broken." The absolute conviction in Thorne's voice cut through her spiraling panic. "You are the strongest person I've ever met. You survived rejection, which would have destroyed most wolves. You walked away from your pack rather than become a burden. And when you found a dying stranger in a blizzard, you used your last supplies and spent 5 nights saving his life. That's not broken, Rowan. That's extraordinary." Tears were falling, now hot against her frozen cheeks. "I can't be a queen. I don't know how to lead. I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy, or—" "Neither did I when I first became king," Thorne said with a small smile. "Leadership is learned, Rowan. But compassion, the ability to see value in others even when you're suffering yourself, that can't be taught, and it's exactly what I need in a mate." Commander Stormheld cleared her throat. "Your Majesty, if I may speak freely?" "Always, Bryn. I've served you for 50 years. In all that time, I've never seen you look at anyone the way you're looking at this Omega. If she's your mate, then she's exactly what you need regardless of her background or status." The commander turned to Rowan and bowed deeply. "My lady, I apologize for my earlier suspicion. Any wolf who would save our king's life deserves our respect and gratitude." Other guards murmured agreement. The suspicious beta from earlier stepped forward and bowed as well. "Forgive me, my lady. I spoke without thinking." "I'm not—" Rowan started, but Thorne squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're my mate," he said firmly, "and therefore the future queen of the Northern Territories. If you'll accept me, that is." Rowan looked at him, at this powerful alpha who was looking at her like she was precious instead of worthless. The mate bond hummed between them, undeniable and real. This wasn't a political calculation or a convenient arrangement. This was what the moon goddess had intended all along. "Why would you want me?" she asked, voicing the fear that had lived in her heart since Garrett's rejection. "After he didn't want me, I thought maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Maybe I really am worthless." "There is nothing wrong with you," Thorne said with fierce intensity. "Garrett rejected you because he's a fool who can't see past political advantage to recognize genuine value. But I see you, Rowan. I see your kindness, your strength, your compassionate heart. And I don't just want you as my mate because the moon goddess chose you. I want you because you're exactly the kind of person I've been hoping to find for over a century." The sincerity in his voice broke through the last of Rowan's defenses. She found herself swaying toward him despite her exhaustion and fear. "I need you to understand something." Thorne continued, his hand moving to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "I'm not asking you to accept me out of gratitude or obligation. If you truly don't want this, if the idea of being my mate is too overwhelming, I'll respect that choice. I'll make sure you're taken care of, help you find a pack that will accept you, and never bother you again." "Even though we're mates," Rowan whispered. "Even then. Because you've already been forced into one bond you didn't choose, and I won't do that to you again. Your choice matters, Rowan. Your feelings matter. You matter." The words were everything she'd needed to hear since Garrett's rejection. Everything he had never said or believed. Looking into Thorne's violet eyes, Rowan saw not just desire or political calculation, but genuine caring and respect. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. I'm scared of being rejected again, of failing at being a queen, of proving everyone right about me being worthless. Then we'll be scared together, Thorne said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him during those long nights in the cabin. Because I'm terrified too. I'm terrified of not being good enough for you, of not being able to undo the damage that rejection did, of failing to show you how valued and precious you truly are. Fresh tears fell, but these weren't tears of pain. You really mean that? Every word. Thorne's thumb brushed away her tears with infinite care. You saved my life, Rowan, not just physically, though you certainly did that, but you also reminded me why I wanted to become king in the first place. To create a world where wolves like you, wolves with kind hearts and compassionate souls, are valued and protected instead of rejected and cast aside. I want to accept, Rowan whispered. I want to believe this is real and that I deserve it. But I'm so afraid of being hurt again. I understand, and I'll wait as long as you need. We can take this slowly, get to know each other properly. You can decide when or if you're ready to formally accept the bond. He squeezed her hand gently. But in the meantime, will you at least come home with me? Let my healers make sure you're healthy after 5 days of keeping me alive in a blizzard. Let me show you what your life could be like if you choose to be my mate. Rowan looked around at the assembled guards, all watching her with expressions of hope and encouragement rather than the suspicion or disdain she was used to seeing. These people had been searching through a blizzard for 5 days for their missing king, and now they were looking at her, a rejected rogue Omega, like she was something precious. Okay, she said, finally feeling something like courage building in her chest. I'll come with you, but just to recover and think about everything. I'm not promising anything more than that. That's all I'm asking, Thorne assured her, and the smile that transformed his scarred face made her heart skip a beat. Commander Stormheld began organizing the evacuation with military efficiency. Medics moved forward to check both Thorne and Rowan for injuries. Someone produced warm clothes and blankets. Food appeared from somewhere, real food, hot and nourishing, the first proper meal Rowan had eaten in over a week. As she sat wrapped in blankets while a kind healer cleaned and bandaged the cuts on her ribs, Rowan watched Thorne being tended to by his own medical team. Even injured and exhausted, he commanded respect and loyalty from every wolf in the cabin. But his eyes kept drifting back to her, checking to make sure she was okay, making sure she felt safe. Maybe, Rowan thought, as warmth and food and safety finally began to sink into her bones, maybe the moon goddess really had been watching over her. Maybe Garrett's rejection hadn't been the end of her story. Maybe it had been the beginning. The helicopter ride to the Northern Palace took 6 hours through weather that would have grounded any civilian aircraft. But the Royal Guard flew with supernatural precision, their pilot navigating mountain passes and storm systems like he could see through the clouds themselves. Rowan sat strapped into a seat that was far too luxurious for military transport, wrapped in thermal blankets that smelled of cedar and pine, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. Thorne sat across from her, his injuries freshly bandaged by the Guard's field medics. He'd refused sedation despite obvious pain, insisting he needed to remain alert until they reached secure territory. His violet eyes tracked her every movement with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. There was protectiveness in that gaze. Possessiveness, yes, but also something softer. Wonder, maybe. Like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Commander Bryn Stormheld occupied the seat beside Thorne, reviewing reports on a tablet with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing crisis situations. She looked up periodically to study Rowan with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to cautious approval. Your Majesty, Bryn said during a lull in the engine noise, we've completed the preliminary investigation into the attack. The evidence is conclusive. All 14 rogues carried weapons traced to Silvercrest Pack's armory. The serial numbers match an inventory conducted 3 months ago. Thorne's jaw tightened. And the payment, $75,000, transferred from an offshore account registered to a shell corporation. We're working on tracing it back to the source, but the encryption is sophisticated. Whoever planned this knew what they were doing. Garrett Ironwood, Rowan said quietly. Both Thorne and Bryn turned to look at her. It has to be. He's the only one who benefits from both your death and mine. Explain, Thorne said, not commanding but genuinely asking. Rowan pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Garrett is ambitious, always has been. His father is Silvercrest's beta, but the current Alpha has 3 sons. Garrett would never inherit leadership through traditional channels, but if he could form an alliance with other packs through marriage, She paused, organizing her thoughts. Cassandra Vale's father is beta of 3 connected packs in Colorado. If Garrett married her, combined their territories, and then somehow removed you as Alpha King, he could declare himself regional Alpha King of the Colorado territories. Bryn finished, her expression darkening. A power play. Start small, consolidate control, then expand. It's an old strategy, but effective if executed properly. And I was in the way, Rowan continued. A true mate bond would have exposed his treachery. I would have felt his guilt, his deception through the connection. So he rejected me publicly, making it seem like a legitimate choice based on political necessity. Then he ordered my death to ensure I could never find a new mate who might discover what he'd done. Thorne's hands clenched into fists. He tried to murder you to cover up a conspiracy. He tried to murder both of us, Rowan corrected. I was just collateral damage. No, Thorne leaned forward, his voice intense. You were never collateral anything. You were a threat because you're exactly what a true mate should be. Perceptive, loyal, and morally sound. He couldn't risk you exposing him, so he tried to destroy you. That's not collateral damage, Rowan. That's premeditated assassination of an innocent. The helicopter banked sharply, beginning its descent. Through the window, Rowan caught her first glimpse of the northern palace and felt her breath catch. It was massive, built from gray stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, despite the overcast sky. 4 towers rose from the corners of the main structure, each one flying banners that snapped in the wind. The palace sat atop a mountain ridge, commanding views of valleys that stretched for miles in every direction. Snow covered everything, turning the landscape into something from a fairy tale. It's too much, Rowan whispered. I can't possibly belong there. You belong wherever I am, Thorne said simply. And I belong there. Therefore you belong there too. The logic was sound, even if Rowan's heart couldn't quite accept it. She pressed her face to the window as they descended, watching the palace grow larger and more intimidating with every passing second. There were people gathered in the courtyard, hundreds of them, all waiting to greet their returning king. The helicopter touched down with barely a bump. Guards immediately surrounded the aircraft, forming a protective perimeter. Commander Bryn exited first, barking orders that sent personnel scrambling in organized chaos. Then she turned and offered her hand to Rowan. Welcome to the Northern Palace, my lady. Try not to let the crowds overwhelm you. They're excited to see His Majesty alive, and word of your heroism has already spread through the ranks. Rowan accepted the hand and stepped out into controlled pandemonium. Wolves in both human and animal forms filled the courtyard, all of them focused on the helicopter with obvious relief and joy. When Thorne emerged behind her, a cheer went up that echoed off the palace walls. But Thorne didn't acknowledge the crowd immediately. Instead, he moved to Rowan's side, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The message was clear to every wolf present. This Omega is mine. This Omega is important. Treat her accordingly. An elderly man stepped forward from near the palace entrance. He wore ceremonial robes that marked him as someone of high rank, and his eyes were the pale blue of glacier ice. Despite his advanced age, he moved with dignified purpose. When he reached Thorne, he bowed deeply. Your Majesty, Elder Aldrich said, his voice carrying despite the noise. Thank the goddess you've returned safely. We feared the worst when the search extended past 72 hours. I would have died, Elder Aldrich, Thorne replied, his hand never leaving Rowan's back. If not for this Omega who found me bleeding out in a blizzard and spent 5 days saving my life. Rowan Ashvale, may I present Elder Aldrich, head of my council and advisor for the past 2 centuries. The elder's pale eyes shifted to Rowan, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. She forced herself to stand straight to meet his gaze, even though every Omega instinct screamed at her to lower her eyes before such a dominant wolf. You saved our king's life, Aldrich said slowly. That is a debt the Northern Territories can never fully repay. Welcome, young Omega. You honor us with your presence. The words were polite, but Rowan heard the questions beneath them. Who are you? Where did you come from? What do you want from our king? I don't want anything, Rowan said quietly. I couldn't let him die. Anyone would have done the same. No, Thorne said firmly. Not anyone. You did. That makes all the difference. More introductions followed in a blur. Healer Oswin, a kind-faced man in his 60s who immediately began fussing over both Thorne's and Rowan's injuries. Lady Isolde, a beautiful she-wolf with amber eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach those eyes when she looked at Rowan. Various council members, guard servants, too many names and faces to remember. Through it all, Thorne kept Rowan close, his presence, a constant reassurance that she wasn't alone in this overwhelming situation. When a servant tried to lead her away to separate quarters, Thorne stopped them with a single look. Miss Ashvale will occupy the Queen's wing, he said, and the entire courtyard went silent. She is my mate. She will be treated with all the respect and consideration due to that position. The gasps were audible. Elder Aldrich's eyes widened. Lady Isolde's smile vanished entirely. But no one dared question the Alpha King's pronouncement. The Queen's wing was more than just quarters. It was an entire section of the palace. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms with actual soaking tubs, a private sitting room, and a balcony that overlooked the western valleys. The furniture was ancient and beautiful, everything polished to a soft gleam. Tapestries hung on the walls depicting scenes from werewolf history, and the bed was so large and soft that Rowan almost cried at the sight of it. "This is too much," she said for what felt like the 100th time. "Your Majesty, I can't possibly—" "Thorn," he interrupted gently. He was leaning against the door frame, clearly exhausted, but refusing to rest until she was settled. "When we're alone, you call me Thorn. And yes, you can possibly. This is exactly what you deserve after spending 5 days in a freezing cabin, keeping me alive." Servants appeared with armfuls of clothing, all in Rowan's size somehow. More servants brought food, real food, hot and plentiful, more than she could eat in a week. Still more servants offered to draw her a bath, unpack her non-existent belongings, and attend to any needs she might have. "I don't need all this," Rowan protested weakly. "I just need to rest," Thorn finished. "To recover, to let yourself be taken care of for once, instead of being the one doing all the caretaking. Can you do that for me, Rowan? Can you let someone else carry the burden for a little while?" The sincerity in his voice undid her. Rowan nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes for reasons she couldn't quite name. "Good, I'll leave you to bathe and rest. We'll talk more in the morning after we've both had proper sleep." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And Rowan, you don't have to make any decisions right now. About the bond, about being queen, about any of it. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Rowan allowed the servants to help her into the bath. The hot water was almost painful against her frost-damaged skin, but in the best way possible. She soaked until the water went lukewarm, scrubbing away days of dirt and blood and fear. When she finally emerged wrapped in a robe softer than anything she'd ever touched, she found a tray of food waiting and clothing laid out on the bed. She ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Then she dressed in the simple cotton nightgown someone had provided and collapsed into the massive bed. Sleep claimed her, instantly pulling her down into darkness so complete she didn't dream at all. The next 7 days passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Thorn kept his promise to give her space, but he was never far away. They took meals together in a small dining room off the main hall, just the two of them talking about everything and nothing. He asked about her childhood, her parents, her herb knowledge. She asked about his century and a half of life, the responsibilities of being Alpha King, the weight of leadership. He never pushed for more, never demanded she make a decision about the mate bond, just existed in her space, patient and kind, and so different from Garrett that sometimes Rowan forgot they were the same species. But not everyone in the palace was as welcoming. On day 10, Rowan woke to find a note slipped under her door. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, with a watermark she didn't recognize. The handwriting was elegant, clearly from someone educated and refined. "You may have saved the king's life, but that doesn't make you queen material. Leave before you embarrass him further. This is kindness. The council will destroy you if you stay. Consider this your only warning." Rowan's hands shook as she read it. Someone in the palace wanted her gone badly enough to threaten her. And they were right about one thing: she had no idea how to navigate this world of politics and power plays. Maybe leaving would be the kindest thing she could do for Thorn. When she showed the note to Thorn during breakfast, his face went cold with fury. "This is from someone on my council," he said, studying the paper against the light. "Someone who thinks they can intimidate my mate into leaving." "Maybe they're right," Rowan whispered. "Maybe I should—" "No." Thorn's voice was absolute. "You stay. We'll find out who sent this, and they'll learn that threatening you is the same as threatening me." But the damage was done. Rowan now knew that not everyone in the palace wanted her there. Some powerful wolves were working against her, and she had no idea who or why. The answer came on day 14 in the form of an invitation. Lady Isolde requested Rowan's presence for afternoon tea in the palace gardens. It seemed friendly enough on the surface, but Rowan sensed the trap immediately. Still refusing would show weakness. So she dressed carefully in one of the simple but elegant gowns the servants had provided and went to face whatever Isolde had planned. The gardens were beautiful even in winter, with evergreen hedges sculpted into elaborate shapes and paths cleared of snow. Isolde waited at a small table set with expensive china, looking every inch the sophisticated noblewoman in her designer dress and perfectly styled hair. "Rowan," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "how lovely of you to join me. Please sit." Rowan sat hyper-aware of every movement, every word. This was a test. She just didn't know what kind yet. "You must be so overwhelmed," Isolde continued, pouring tea with practiced grace. "All these rules and protocols. The council meetings where they discuss treaties and territorial disputes and languages you probably don't even speak. I imagine it's all quite beyond your background." There it was, the subtle insult wrapped in false sympathy. "I'm learning," Rowan said evenly. "Of course you are. With enough tutoring, anyone can memorize the basics." Isolde's smile sharpened. "But there's a difference between memorizing and truly understanding, between performing the role of queen and actually being one, between book knowledge and the instincts that come from being raised in this world." "What are you trying to say, Lady Isolde?" "I'm trying to help you, dear." Isolde leaned forward, her voice dropping to something that might have sounded concerned to anyone listening. "The king is infatuated now. The mate bond is intoxicating, I understand. But infatuation fades, and when it does, when the initial passion cools, he'll need a queen who can actually serve the Northern Territories. Someone raised for this. Someone who understands the intricacies of pack politics, interterritorial diplomacy, economic management. Someone like me." Rowan set down her teacup carefully. "The moon goddess chose me as Thorn's mate. Are you suggesting she made a mistake?" Isolde's expression flickered just for a moment with something like fear. Challenging the goddess's choice was dangerous ground, bordering on blasphemy. "Of course not," she recovered quickly. "I'm merely suggesting that divine selection and political reality are two different things. You'll see, when the treaty negotiations start in 3 months, when you're expected to represent the Northern Territories at the Continental Summit, when you have to manage the Economic Council's budget disputes, that's when you'll understand. The goddess may have chosen you for the king's heart, but his kingdom needs more than heart. It needs competence." "I see." Rowan stood, her voice cold. "Thank you for the tea, Lady Isolde, and for clarifying your position so thoroughly. I'll be sure to remember this conversation when the time comes." She walked away, leaving Isolde staring after her with poorly concealed frustration. The encounter shook Rowan more than she wanted to admit. Because Isolde was right about one thing, Rowan had no idea how to navigate high-level pack politics. She didn't speak the old tongue. She'd never managed a territorial budget. She couldn't identify the noble families of the 7 major packs on site, but she could learn, and she would. That evening, Rowan found Thorn in his private study reviewing documents that would determine resource allocation for the entire Northern Territories. She knocked on the open door. "Come in," he said, looking up with a smile that transformed his scarred face. "I was just thinking about you." "I need to learn," Rowan said without preamble. "Everything. Pack politics, economics, diplomacy, the old tongue, noble lineages, treaty law, all of it. Will you teach me or find someone who will?" Thorn set down his paper, studying her face. "What happened?" "Lady Isolde helped me understand something today. She's right that I don't know how to be a queen, but she's wrong that I can't learn." Rowan's voice was steady, determined. "I may not have been raised for this, but the goddess chose me anyway. Either she made a mistake, which is impossible, or she saw something in me that can do this job. I just need to discover what that is." Pride blazed in Thorn's eyes. He stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You already have what matters most, the desire to serve, the humility, to know what you don't know, and the courage to ask for help. The rest is just knowledge, and knowledge can be taught. So you'll help me. I'll do better than that. Starting tomorrow, you'll study with Elder Aldrich in the morning's pack history, noble lineages, and protocol. Commander Bryn will teach you territorial strategy and defense logistics in the afternoons. Healer Oswin will tutor you in medicine and wellness policy. And I will personally teach you diplomacy, economics, and the old tongue in the evenings." That's a lot. "You saved my life by refusing to give up when everything seemed impossible," Thorn said softly. "I think you can handle a rigorous study schedule." The next morning, Rowan presented herself to Elder Aldrich's private study at precisely 8 o'clock. The old wolf looked surprised to see her, but gestured to a chair across from his massive desk. "Lady Isolde told me you'd be leaving soon," he said bluntly, running back to whatever pack would take a rejected Omega. She seemed quite certain. "Lady Isolde doesn't speak for me," Rowan replied, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd teach me properly, Elder Aldrich, rather than waiting for me to fail and disappear." The old wolf's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Very well. Let's start with the founding of the Northern Territories and work our way forward through 3,000 years of pack history. Take notes. There will be a test. On day 13, Commander Bryn requested an urgent meeting with Thorn. Rowan was with him in the library, struggling through a text in the old tongue when the commander arrived. She moved to leave, but Thorn gestured for her to stay. "This concerns you as much as me," he said quietly. Bryn's expression was grim. "We've completed the investigation, Your Majesty. The evidence is conclusive. Garrett Ironwood hired the 14 rogues through an intermediary 6 weeks ago. The $75,000 payment came from an offshore account he established 6 months ago under a false name. We also found detailed plans in his private study plans to unify 4 Colorado packs through his marriage to Cassandra Vale, then use that power base to challenge your authority over the Northern Territories. And the attempt on Rowan's life." Thorn's voice was dangerously quiet. "Explicitly ordered in written communications we recovered from his encrypted email server." Quote, "The Omega cannot be allowed to find a new mate. She would sense the bond betrayal and expose everything. Arrange an accident, freezing in the wilderness. Make it look natural. No evidence. No survivors." End quote. Bryn's eyes shifted to Rowan with sympathy. "I'm sorry, my lady, but he tried to have you murdered to cover up his conspiracy." Rowan felt oddly numb. She'd suspected, of course. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the evidence laid out in black and white, made it real in a way that turned her stomach. "There's more," Bryn continued. "Silvercrest Pack arrives tomorrow for their annual treaty renewal. Garrett will be part of the delegation. They don't know we've completed the investigation. I recommend we proceed with the treaty meetings as planned, then arrest him publicly with full evidence presentation." "No," Thorn said. "We do this properly. Full council tribunal, all evidence on record, complete transparency. I want every pack in the Northern Territories to see what happens to wolves who betray their king and attempt to murder innocents." That night, Rowan couldn't sleep. She stood on her balcony in the freezing air, wrapped in furs, staring out at the mountains and trying to make sense of everything. Tomorrow, Garrett would arrive. Tomorrow, she would see the wolf who had rejected her, humiliated her, and then tried to have her killed. "You should be inside." Thorn's voice came from behind her. "It's negative 20 degrees out here." "I can't sleep," Rowan admitted. "I keep thinking about tomorrow, about seeing him again." Thorn moved to stand beside her close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to. You can stay in your quarters. I'll handle everything." "No." Rowan surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "I need to face him. I need to look him in the eye and let him see that I survived, that his rejection didn't destroy me, that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for." "You are," Thorn said softly, "stronger than anyone I've ever known." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching northern lights dance across the sky. Then Rowan asked the question that had been haunting her since the helicopter ride. "Why me, Thorn? You could have any she-wolf in the world. Powerful females from influential packs who know how to be queens. Why would the moon goddess pair you with a nobody Omega who can barely read political situations?" Thorn turned to face her fully. "Because power and influence aren't what make a good queen. Compassion does. The ability to see people as individuals rather than political assets. The courage to do what's right even when it's hard. You have all of that, Rowan. Those things can't be taught or inherited. They're part of who you are at your core." "But I'm terrified," Rowan whispered. "Terrified of failing you, of embarrassing you in front of your people, of proving that Garrett was right about me being worthless." "Then let me tell you something," Thorn said, reaching out to cup her face gently. "In the 5 days we spent in that cabin, while I was drifting in and out of consciousness, I heard every word you said. I heard you talk about feeling worthless, about thinking maybe it would be easier to die than face a future alone. And I made myself a promise. If I survived, if the moon goddess gave me the chance, I would spend the rest of my life showing you that you are not worthless, that you are precious and valued, and exactly what I've been waiting for across a century and a half of existence." Tears froze on Rowan's cheeks. "I want to believe that." "Then believe this," Thorn said, his violet eyes intense on hers. "Tomorrow, when Garrett Ironwood walks into my palace, he's going to see you standing beside me as my mate. He's going to understand that his cruelty didn't break you. It freed you to find something infinitely better. And he's going to realize that his attempt to destroy us both was the biggest mistake of his pathetic life." Rowan found herself leaning into his warmth, her head resting against his chest. His arms came around her carefully like she was something fragile that might break. But she didn't feel fragile. Not anymore. She felt like tempered steel tested by fire and emerged stronger. "I'm still scared," she admitted into his shirt. "Good," Thorne murmured against her hair. "Fear means you understand the stakes, but you're not facing this alone, not anymore. We face it together." They stood like that until the cold became unbearable, then Thorne walked her back to her quarters. At the door, he hesitated. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow changes everything." Rowan slept better that night than she had since the rejection. And when she woke on day 16 to news that the Silvercrest delegation had arrived, she dressed carefully in a deep green gown that Commander Bryn had selected, styled her hair in a simple braid, and prepared to face the wolf who had tried to destroy her. She was ready to reclaim her power. The Silvercrest delegation arrived at noon under heavy gray skies that threatened more snow. Rowan watched from a third-floor window as 30 wolves in formal dress disembarked from 3 black SUVs in the palace courtyard. Her heart hammered against her ribs when she spotted Garrett Ironwood stepping out of the lead vehicle. He looked exactly the same. Tall and handsome in a conventional way with sandy brown hair and the confident bearing of a wolf who'd never questioned his own importance. Beside him walked Cassandra Vale, pretty and polished in expensive furs, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Beta Vale followed along with various pack officials and guards. None of them looked concerned. None of them suspected that this routine diplomatic visit would end with their alpha in chains. "They have no idea," Commander Bryn said from behind Rowan. The older warrior had appeared silently, as was her way. "Garrett thinks he got away with it, thinks you're dead and frozen in some canyon, and the king's assassination was blamed on random rogues." "Good," Rowan said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Let him think he's safe. Let him walk into that council chamber arrogant and smug. The fall will be so much harder." Bryn's expression shifted to something like approval. "You're stronger than you know, my lady. The king chose well." Rowan turned from the window. She wore the deep green gown that Commander Bryn had selected, formal enough for a council meeting, but not ostentatious. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. No jewelry except for a silver pendant that had belonged to her mother. She looked like exactly what she was, an omega of no particular status or wealth. But she stood straight, met Bryn's eyes without flinching. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'm ready." The walk to the council chamber took 5 minutes through corridors lined with palace guards, standing at attention. Word had spread through the palace staff that something significant was happening. Servants paused in their work to watch Rowan pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to outright excitement. Thorne waited outside the chamber doors dressed in formal black that emphasized his AlphaKing status. The royal seal was embroidered in silver on his chest. His violet eyes tracked Rowan's approach with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly when she reached him. "You can wait in your quarters. I'll handle everything." "No," Rowan squared her shoulders. "I need to be there. I need to see his face when he realizes I survived." Thorne studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close to me. The moment you want to leave, just say the word." The council chamber was enormous, with vaulted ceilings and windows that stretched 20 feet high. A massive oak table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs for 50 council members. Every seat was filled. Alphas from across the Northern Territories had gathered for what they'd been told was an emergency session regarding a security breach. The Silvercrest delegation occupied chairs on the far side of the table. Garrett sat in the center looking relaxed and confident. Cassandra was to his right, Beta Vale to his left. They were talking quietly among themselves, completely unaware of the trap closing around them. Thorne entered first, and every wolf in the room immediately stood and bowed. He acknowledged them with a nod, then moved to the head of the table. Rowan followed, acutely aware of every eye tracking her movement. That's when Garrett looked up and saw her. The color drained from his face. His mouth fell open in shock. For 3 full seconds, he just stared like his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. "Rowan," he whispered loud enough in the suddenly silent chamber that everyone heard. I thought." His words cut off abruptly as realization crashed over him. If Rowan was alive, if she was here in the palace standing beside the AlphaKing. "Hello, Garrett," Rowan said calmly. "Surprised to see me?" Garrett's eyes darted between Rowan and Thorne, calculations racing behind his gaze. Beside him, Cassandra looked confused. Beta Vale had gone very still, the stillness of a wolf sensing danger. "I don't understand," Garrett said, attempting to recover his composure. "Rowan, what are you doing here? I thought you'd left pack territories entirely after—" He trailed off, apparently remembering that publicly acknowledging the rejection might not play well. "After you rejected me in front of 200 witnesses," Rowan finished for him. "Oh, I left." Walked straight into the wilderness with $47 and a backpack. Funny thing about that timing, though, the same day I left Silvercrest, 14 rogues attacked the Alpha King during a border patrol, used silver weapons, left him to die in a blizzard. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. Garrett's face went from pale to ashen. I don't know anything about that, he stammered. Why would I? Sit down, Ironwood. Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. The alpha command behind the words was so powerful that Garrett's legs buckled and he dropped into his chair without conscious thought. You'll speak when spoken to and not before. Every wolf from Silvercrest looked terrified now. They'd come expecting a routine treaty renewal. Instead, they'd walked into a tribunal. Thorne remained standing, his presence dominating the room. This council is called to order to address charges of conspiracy, attempted regicide, and attempted murder against Garrett Ironwood Alpha of Silvercrest Pack. Commander Stormheld, present the evidence. Bryn stepped forward, activating a screen on the wall behind the council table. Images appeared, weapons laid out on a white cloth, each one tagged with evidence markers. 14 silver daggers, Bryn announced, recovered from the site where His Majesty was attacked. Serial numbers traced to Silvercrest Pack's armory. Inventory records confirm these weapons were signed out 3 weeks ago by... She paused for effect. Alpha Garrett Ironwood. Garrett surged to his feet. That's a lie. I never... Sit down. Thorne didn't raise his voice, but the command sent Garrett crashing back into his chair like he'd been hit with a physical force. The next image showed bank records, highlighted transactions in amounts that made several council members gasp. $75,000, Bryn continued, transferred from an offshore account registered to a shell corporation. We traced the ownership through 4 layers of encryption. The account belongs to Garrett Ironwood. The payment was made to a known rogue mercenary broker 6 days before the attack on His Majesty. More images, printed emails, text message screenshots, each one more damning than the last. We recovered these communications from Ironwood's private study, Bryn said. Direct negotiations with the mercenary broker. Explicit instructions to assassinate the Alpha King during his border patrol. Make it look like a random rogue attack. Leave no survivors. Garrett's face had gone from pale to gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chamber's cold temperature. This is fabricated. Someone is framing me. I would never... There's more, Bryn interrupted. A new image appeared, handwritten notes in Garrett's distinctive scrawl. Your personal plans recovered from a hidden safe in your study. Detailed strategy for unifying 4 Colorado packs through marriage alliance with the Vale family. Step-by-step outline for challenging the Alpha King's authority once you'd consolidated enough power. And here, she zoomed in on a particular section. Plans to eliminate the current Alpha King and declare yourself regional Alpha King of Colorado territories. The council chamber erupted. Alphas shouted questions. Some demanded immediate execution. Others called for due process. Through it all, Garrett sat frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Order, Thorne's voice cut through the cave. Silence fell instantly. There is one more piece of evidence. Commander, Bryn's expression softened slightly as she looked at Rowan. This concerns the second target. The communications we recovered included explicit orders regarding an Omega named Rowan Ashvale. A new image appeared. An email, stark black text on white background. The Omega cannot be allowed to find a new mate. She would sense the bond betrayal and expose everything. Arrange an accident, freezing in the wilderness. Make it look natural. No evidence. No survivors. The chamber went absolutely silent. Every eye turned to Rowan. She felt the weight of their stares but kept her gaze locked on Garrett, watching the exact moment he realized his conspiracy had been completely exposed. You tried to have me killed, Rowan said, her voice clear and steady in the silence. Not just rejected, not just cast out. You ordered my murder to cover up your treason. Garrett's voice cracked. It wasn't personal. You have to understand, I couldn't risk... Couldn't risk what? Rowan interrupted, taking a step closer to the table. Couldn't risk me finding a true mate who would sense your guilt through our bond. Couldn't risk me exposing that you'd hired assassins to murder the Alpha King. So you decided I was acceptable collateral damage. You were nobody, Garrett shouted, his composure finally shattering completely. A worthless Omega with no status, no connections, nothing to offer. Yes, I rejected you. Yes, I arranged for your death because you were in my way, and removing obstacles is what leaders do. The confession hung in the air like poison. Several council members made sounds of disgust. Beta Vale had buried his face in his hands. Cassandra was crying quietly, apparently shocked that the wolf she'd agreed to marry was a murderer. "Thank you," Thorne said coldly, "for confirming everything. Your confession has been recorded and will be entered into the official record." Garrett seemed to realize what he'd done. His face went from gray to white. "No, wait. I didn't mean I was upset. You can't—" "Guards," Thorne said quietly. 6 palace guards stepped forward, moving with synchronized precision. "Take him into custody." They hauled Garrett out of his chair. He struggled, tried to shift into wolf form, but Thorne's alpha command crashed down like a physical weight, preventing the transformation. "You can't do this," Garrett screamed as the guards dragged him toward the chamber doors. "I'm an alpha. I have rights. You can't just—" "You forfeited your rights when you committed treason," Thorne said, his voice hard as stone. "You are no longer an alpha. You are no longer anything except a criminal awaiting sentence." The doors slammed shut behind Garrett and his guards. The silence that followed was deafening. Thorne turned to face the council. "Beta Vale, as the ranking official of Silvercrest Pack, present you will answer for your involvement in this conspiracy." Vale stood on shaking legs. "Your Majesty, I swear on my life I knew nothing of this. The weapons were signed out on Garrett's authority. I never questioned it. The offshore accounts, the communications, the plans, I was completely unaware. My only crime was trusting an alpha who didn't deserve that trust." Thorne studied him for a long moment. "Commander Bryn, did your investigation find evidence of Beta Vale's involvement?" "No, Your Majesty. All evidence points to Garrett Ironwood acting alone, using his alpha authority to access pack resources without oversight." "Then you are not charged with treason, Beta Vale. However, your failure to maintain proper oversight of your alpha's activities represents gross negligence. Silvercrest Pack will be placed under royal oversight for a period of 10 years. All major decisions must be approved by my council. You will step down as Beta and accept demotion to Gamma rank. A new leadership structure will be implemented immediately." Vale bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you for your mercy." Thorne's gaze shifted to Cassandra. The young she-wolf looked terrified, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Vale, what did you know of Garrett Ironwood's plans?" "Nothing," Cassandra gasped. "I swear, Your Majesty, I knew nothing. He told me the rejection was purely political, that he needed the alliance with my father's packs. He never mentioned murder or treason or—" Her voice broke. "If I'd known, I never would have agreed to the arrangement. Never." "You are not charged," Thorne said, his voice slightly gentler. "However, the marriage arrangement is dissolved. The alliance between Silvercrest and your father's packs is void. You are free to return to your family." The remainder of the Silvercrest delegation was questioned briefly, then dismissed. None of them had known about Garrett's conspiracy. They'd simply been following their alpha's orders, assuming everything was legitimate. When the chamber finally cleared of everyone except council members, Thorne turned to address them formally. "The evidence is conclusive. Garrett Ironwood hired mercenaries to assassinate me, then ordered the murder of an innocent Omega to cover his crimes. He planned to use my death as an opportunity to seize power over multiple pack territories. His actions represent the highest form of treason against the Northern Territories." Elder Aldrich stood. "What sentence do you propose, Your Majesty?" "For attempted regicide and conspiracy to commit treason, Garrett Ironwood is stripped of his alpha status permanently. He will serve 25 years hard labor in the northern work camps as an Omega laborer. No special treatment, no privileges. He will learn what it means to be the nobody he so despised." Several council members nodded approval. It was a harsh sentence, but appropriate for the crimes. "There is one more matter," Thorne continued. He held out his hand to Rowan. She took it, feeling the eyes of 50 powerful alphas on her as she stepped forward to stand beside the king. "This is Rowan Ashvale. She saved my life when I was dying from the injuries Garrett's mercenaries inflicted. She spent 5 days in a freezing cabin, keeping me alive with nothing but herb knowledge and determination. And during those 5 days," he paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in, "the moon goddess blessed us with the mate bond." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps, whispers. Several council members surged to their feet in shock. Elder Aldrich's pale blue eyes went wide. "Your Majesty," the elder said carefully, "this Omega is a rejected wolf. She has no pack standing, no political connections. While we are grateful for her heroism, surely you cannot mean to—" The rest of his sentence died as the chamber's temperature plummeted. Not metaphorically, actually dropped. Frost formed on the windows, the overhead lights flickered, and the very air itself seemed to vibrate with power. Every wolf in the chamber felt it, a presence beyond anything mortal. ancient, eternal, divine. The great tapestries on the walls began to move, despite the absence of wind. Northern lights appeared outside the windows, blazing across the afternoon sky in impossible colors. And then she appeared, the moon goddess. Not in physical form exactly, but as a manifestation of pure power and light. A female wolf made of starlight and silver moonbeams, larger than life, standing at the head of the council table where all could see her. Every wolf in the chamber dropped to their knees. Rowan tried to do the same, but found herself unable to move, held upright by an invisible force. When the goddess spoke, her voice was everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the chamber and through every wolf's mind simultaneously. The bond between Thorn Ravencrest and Rowan Ashvale is mine. I forged it across time and distance, through pain and suffering, for a purpose beyond your mortal understanding. The light intensified. Rowan felt warmth spreading through her body, starting from her chest and radiating outward. Looking down, she saw silver symbols appearing on her skin, ancient runes that glowed with their own internal light. Those who conspired against this bond have faced my judgment. Garrett Ironwood will live out his days in suffering, knowing his cruelty freed Rowan to find her true destiny. His punishment is my will. The goddess turned her attention to the kneeling council members. Let no wolf question what I have ordained. Rowan Ashvale is chosen. She is blessed. She is worthy. And any who speak against her speak against me. The presence faded slowly, the light dimming until the goddess was gone. The northern lights outside the windows danced for a few more seconds, then vanished. The temperature returned to normal. But the silver runes on Rowan's skin remained visible for a full minute before gradually fading to invisibility. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Then Elder Aldrich spoke, his voice shaking. The goddess has spoken. The bond is divinely ordained. He bowed deeply to Rowan, his forehead touching the floor. Your Majesty, forgive my doubt. The goddess's wisdom far exceeds our mortal understanding. Every other council member followed suit, bowing to Rowan with the same reverence they showed Thorn. When they rose, their expressions had transformed from skepticism to awe. I believe, Thorn said with a slight smile, that settles the question of Rowan's worthiness to be queen. The council unanimously voted to approve the mate bond and Rowan's eventual coronation. There were no dissenting voices. How could there be, when the moon goddess herself had appeared to validate the match? 3 days later, on a crystalline Sunday morning, with the sun turning the snow-covered mountains into fields of diamonds, the formal mating ceremony took place. 800 wolves gathered in the palace's great hall. Alphas from every pack in the northern territories. Betas, gammas, warriors, healers, servants. Everyone who could fit into the massive space came to witness their king bind himself to the Omega who'd saved his life. Rowan wore white, a gown that had been made specifically for her by the palace's finest seamstresses. Silver wolves were embroidered along the hem and sleeves, their eyes picked out in tiny diamonds that caught the light with every movement. Her dark hair hung loose down her back, woven with winter flowers that shouldn't have been blooming, but had appeared overnight in the palace gardens, another sign of the goddess's blessing. Thorn wore traditional ceremonial armor, black leather, and silver mail that had been worn by AlphaKings for 3 centuries. The royal seal blazed on his chest. His violet eyes never left Rowan's face as she walked down the aisle toward him. Elder Aldrich performed the ceremony, speaking the ancient words in the old tongue, while 200 years of tradition played out in precise ritual. Blood exchanged from a ceremonial chalice that had witnessed 1,000 matings. Vows spoken in both the old tongue and English, binding them together before the goddess and their people. The exchange of marks, Thorn's canines extending as he gently bit into the junction of Rowan's neck and shoulder. Then Rowan doing the same to him, sealing their bond in a way that could never be broken. When Thorn placed the Luna Queen's crown on Rowan's head, a delicate circlet of silver set with moonstones, the entire hall erupted in cheers. And when they kissed, sealing the bond completely, the supernatural response was immediate and overwhelming. Northern lights blazed across the sky despite the afternoon sun. The temperature warmed snow beginning to melt even in the depths of winter. And on the mountains surrounding the palace, translucent silver wolves appeared, spirit animals, ancient ancestors, the physical manifestation of the goddess's approval. They threw back their heads and howled, and every wolf in the hall felt the sound resonate in their bones. The bond's completion sent out a pulse of power that every supernatural creature within 100 miles could sense. It felt like warm sunlight after years of winter, like coming home after a long journey, like the world clicking into place exactly as it was meant to be. Rowan stood beside Thorn, his arm around her waist, the crown on her head feeling surprisingly light. She looked out at the sea of faces, wolves, who weeks ago would have dismissed her as worthless, now looking at her with respect and even love. The celebration lasted 3 days. But for Rowan, the real transformation had already happened. She was no longer the rejected Omega who'd fled into the wilderness to die. She was the Luna Queen chosen by the moon goddess mate to the most powerful Alpha in existence. 8 months passed in a blur of learning and growing. Rowan studied pack politics with Elder Aldrich, who'd become one of her strongest supporters. She learned diplomacy from Commander Bryn combat strategy, from the Royal Guard healing techniques from Oswin. Thorn was patient and supportive through every stumble and success, never doubting her ability to become the queen his people needed. On a bright spring morning, Rowan stood in the council chamber for her first major decision as Luna Queen. Two packs had come to her with a territorial dispute, a boundary conflict that had been simmering for years. The old Rowan would have stayed silent, let others make the decision, doubted her own judgment. Queen Rowan listened carefully to both sides, studied the maps and historical records, then proposed a solution that had both alphas blinking in surprise. The disputed territory contains a river rich with salmon and forests full of elk, she said clearly. Rather than divide it and ensure both packs have inadequate access to resources, I propose a seasonal sharing arrangement. Pack Redwood gets primary access during spring and summer for salmon runs. Pack Stoneheart gets primary access during fall and winter for elk hunting. Both packs maintain small, permanent camps in the territory to prevent rogue encroachment. The arrangement is reviewed annually and adjusted as needed. There was a moment of silence. Then both alphas bowed. Your Majesty, this is actually brilliant, the Redwood Alpha said. We accept. As do we, Stoneheart's Alpha agreed. Thank you, Luna Queen. The council burst into applause. Even Elder Aldrich was smiling. The goddess chose wisely, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Our queen has wisdom beyond her years. Later that afternoon, Rowan visited the hunting cabin where she'd saved Thorn's life. It had been preserved exactly as it was, but now it was surrounded by offerings. Flowers, herbs, small tokens left by wolves who considered it a sacred site. A brass plaque had been installed beside the door. Here, Rowan Ashvale saved AlphaKing Thorn Ravencrest and changed the destiny of all wolves. 8 miles through negative 42-degree blizzard, 5 days of survival. One act of mercy that transformed a kingdom. Thorn found her there, standing in the doorway and staring at the small space that had held so much suffering and hope. Having second thoughts, he asked gently. Never, Rowan said, turning to smile at him. I was just thinking about how much has changed. 8 months ago, I was ready to die in the snow. I thought I was worthless, that Garrett's rejection proved something was fundamentally wrong with me. And now I know that his rejection was the goddess moving me toward my real purpose. He set me free without meaning to. She moved into Thorn's arms, resting her head against his chest. You saved my life too, you know, not just by being my mate, but by showing me that I was never the problem, that I had value all along even when I couldn't see it myself. Thorn's arms tightened around her. You gave me back my faith in what leadership should be. I was becoming cold cynical, making decisions based purely on political advantage. You reminded me that compassion and justice matter more than power. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's warmth, until Rowan remembered something. There's one more thing I need to do today, she said. One final piece of business. An hour later, she stood at a podium in the palace's main courtyard, addressing 2,000 gathered wolves. The crowd included representatives from every pack in the Northern Territories, all gathered for what had been billed as a major policy announcement. Thorn stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on her visibly pregnant belly. 6 months along, carrying the next generation of the royal bloodline. The news had been announced just last week, and the entire territory was celebrating. My fellow wolves, Rowan began, her voice amplified by the sound system to reach every ear. 8 months ago, I was publicly rejected by my alpha, cast out with nothing, left to die in the wilderness. I survived through this goddess's grace and the king's mercy, but thousands of other Omegas have not been so fortunate. The crowd had gone silent, hanging on every word. Today, I am announcing the Omega Protection Act. Effective immediately, no wolf may be rejected without full council review. Both parties must appear before regional leadership and present their cases. If rejection is approved, the rejected wolf receives mandatory support, financial assistance, territory placement, counseling, and protection from retaliation. She paused, letting the words sink in. Furthermore, any alpha who uses false mate, claims for political advantage, or who harms or orders harm against a rejected mate will face immediate removal from power and criminal prosecution. We will no longer tolerate Omegas being treated as disposable resources. The crowd erupted in cheers. Rowan saw Omega wolves in the audience openly crying with relief and joy. This law is named in honor of every Omega who suffered what I suffered. Rowan continued when the noise died down, and in warning to every Alpha who thinks rejection is a casual political tool. The goddess gave us the mate bond as a sacred gift. Those who abuse it will answer to both divine and mortal justice. The applause lasted 5 full minutes. When it finally subsided, Thorn stepped forward. "The Queen has spoken," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The Omega Protection Act is now law throughout the Northern Territories. Any pack that fails to comply will lose their territorial rights and face sanctions. This is not negotiable." That evening, Rowan stood on her private balcony, watching the sun set over the mountains. Northern lights were already beginning to dance across the darkening sky. They appeared almost every night now, the goddess's constant reminder of her blessing. Thorn joined her, wrapping a fur around her shoulders against the cold. His hand found her belly, feeling the strong kicks of their unborn child. "History will remember this day," he said quietly. "The day the Luna Queen changed the world for every Omega in the kingdom." "Good," Rowan replied. "Let them remember. Let them know that rejected wolves can survive, can thrive, can become exactly who they were meant to be." Far to the south in the northern work camps, Garrett Ironwood collapsed into his bunk after 14 hours of brutal labor. His hands were bloody and blistered from hauling timber. His back ached from the endless physical demands. His Omega status in the camp meant he received no respect, no privileges, no mercy. The other Omega laborers avoided him. They knew what he'd done, tried to murder the beloved Luna Queen. In the camp's brutal hierarchy, that made him lower than dirt. "Ironwood," a guard's voice barked. "Mess hall, mandatory viewing. Now!" Garrett dragged himself upright and shuffled to the communal eating area with the other exhausted laborers. A large screen had been set up, showing a live broadcast from the palace. His stomach dropped when he recognized the setting. Queen Rowan stood at a podium, radiant and powerful in royal robes, her pregnant belly visible beneath the fine fabric. Beside her stood King Thorn, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Behind them, the entire royal council stood in unified support. The volume increased as Rowan began speaking about the Omega Protection Act. Around Garrett, the other Omega laborers began to weep, some with relief, others with joy. One elderly Omega near him whispered, "Thank the goddess. My granddaughter won't suffer like I did." "Look at what you tried to destroy," a guard said, standing directly behind Garrett. "A queen who actually cares about Omegas like you. A queen who's changing laws to protect the vulnerable. And look at what you became." On screen, the crowd erupted in cheers as Rowan finished her speech. The camera zoomed in on her face, confident, compassionate, everything a true queen should be. The complete opposite of the broken Omega Garrett had cast aside. 19 more years, Ironwood," the guard said with cruel satisfaction. "And you'll spend every single one of them knowing that she won. That the worthless Omega you rejected became the most beloved queen in Northern history, while you became nothing." Garrett turned his face to the wall, trying to block out the sound of celebration from the screen, the quiet sobbing of grateful Omegas around him, the weight of his own catastrophic mistakes. She had survived. She had won. And he had lost everything. Tomorrow he would wake at dawn and return to the timber yards. And the day after, and the day after that, for 19 more years, unless the brutal labor killed him first. Part of him hoped it would. The years flowed like water. Queen Rowan's reign became legendary, 200 years of wisdom, compassion, and unwavering justice. The Omega Protection Act saved over 10,000 wolves from rejection abuse. The hunting cabin became the most visited sacred site in werewolf history, a place where the rejected came to pray for strength and hope. And Garrett Ironwood died in the labor camps after 19 years, his name erased from Silvercrest Pack history, unmourned and forgotten, by everyone except historians, who used him as a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. But that was far in the future. Tonight, Rowan Asheville Ravencrest, Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, stood wrapped in her mate's arms beneath dancing northern lights, their child moving strongly in her womb, and knew with absolute certainty that every moment of suffering had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Sometimes rejection is just the goddess's way of moving you toward your true destiny. Sometimes saving a stranger in a blizzard changes everything. And sometimes the Omega everyone dismissed as worthless becomes the most beloved queen the North has ever known. The rejected Omega had found her dying wolf in the snow, and in saving him, she had saved herself.